This is PowerPoint Lecture 1.4 for Survey of Economics. And in this PowerPoint, we will discuss the idea of equilibrium in two aspects of it. First of all, we'll talk about market equilibrium, and then the second thing we'll talk about the profit maximizing level of output equilibrium, the equilibrium level of output. And you see what we'll cover here is equilibrium in the market mechanism, shortages, surpluses, shifts in the market equilibrium, shifts in profit maximization, level of output, short run versus long run, production, and economic efficiency, and the idea of economic efficiency. Kind of to preface the discussion of equilibrium both in markets and in profit maximizing level of output, we want to keep in the back of our mind that economics is, by its nature, a dynamic system. Okay, now to line this up, there are two types of systems. There are dynamic systems and there are static systems. A static system is one that never moves out of equilibrium. Okay, it stays in equilibrium. Dynamic systems fluctuate out of equilibrium. Now, when dealing with dynamic systems, we deal with two kinds: stable systems and unstable systems. Unstable systems are systems that when the equilibrium is disturbed, there is no natural tendency for them to restore equilibrium. Okay, they can go out of equilibrium, and that's instability. Whereas with a stable system, people confuse all the time a stable system with a static system. That's not the same thing. A stable system is a dynamic system that has a natural tendency to move towards an equilibrium point. Economics is a dynamic, stable system. Now, to give you examples of this, if you look at a screw is a static system. Anytime it's used exactly the same way. It never disturbs equilibrium. It always stays exactly as is. Okay, whereas a dynamic system is something like the human body. Okay, the human body, if you engage in vigorous exercise of any kind, you'll note that the level of your heart rate, your blood pressure, etc., your respirations per minute will increase. Okay, that's dynamic. Now, the human body, like economics, is also a stable system, meaning that once that equilibrium level is disturbed, there is a natural tendency for that equilibrium to be restored. Okay, the system itself abhors instability; it wants equilibrium. Okay, and so for example, if you engage in vigorous exercise, your heart rate will go up, blood pressure will go up, etc. And once you've stopped and you're at rest again, you'll note that your heart rate goes down again, equilibrium restores. Economics is the same way. It's what we refer to in economics. It's what Adam Smith, I think, first coined the phrase back in the 18th century of the invisible hand, what we sometimes refer to as the market mechanism. That when equilibrium is disturbed, there's a natural tendency to move back into equilibrium. And that's why in economics, the way we call what we say about this is we say that markets have a tendency to clear. Okay, equilibrium will be restored. Okay, now when we deal with equilibrium, what we're ultimately dealing with is balance. Equilibrium is balance. What we're balancing in economics, as I've mentioned before, money has two directions in which it flows. It flows in, it flows out. Equilibrium is money in equals money out. Okay, and if we look at this as consumption and supply, okay, as consumption and production, money in, that's our producer making money. That is equal to money out, the demander spending money. Okay, we'll deal with this when we get the gross domestic product as well, and we'll deal with it then. And so technically, we're looking at a situation where supply equals demand, where buyer and seller agree on price and quantity. And it's important to note, the reason I prefaced it with that little synopsis of static and dynamic systems is because nowhere does it even remotely suggest that economic markets are static. The point of equilibrium, and it will be a unique point, okay, And it's a unique point actually kind of derived from the law of supply and demand because they are in direct opposition to each other. If you put them on a Cartesian coordinate, they will intersect. They will intersect at a unique point. Okay. It's just a question of where. In microeconomics, we actually spend some time with linear functions and actually determining where the equilibrium point's going to be. Here we don't. We don't get into that kind of depth. But at any rate, nowhere are we suggesting that this equilibrium point adheres for any length of time. In fact, it is constantly changing. And one of the fun things to do is if you go on to any Charles Schwab or Fidelity or any of those sites and you look at stocks during any given day, you'll notice a massive, the fluctuation in the equilibrium, price and quantity, how much people are willing to pay, how much people are demanding, okay, the ask and buy. That'll change minute by minute, okay? So when we look at equilibrium, it does not, by any stretch of the imagination, stay constant. The same can be said of profit maximization equilibrium. When we talk about the equilibrium point of profit maximization, what we're talking about is the optimal level of production to achieve profit maximization. That too will change. It will change in both the short run and it will change in the long run. Now let's look at what equilibrium looks at or looks like. Okay, here we have weekly supply and demand for fish sandwiches at a local tavern. This is derived from the models that we built in supply and demand. And we see here a classic example of a supply schedule. Price goes up. As the price goes up, the quantity supplied goes up. Here we have demand. As the price goes up, demand goes down. And where they meet is this point here. We've graphically illustrated this with this graph. Here is the supply function. Here is the demand function. You see that they intersect at this point, and you see that that point is unique. However, that point is not static. Okay, it will change, and we'll look at the factors, and that's what we largely devote ourselves to here is determining under what conditions it changes, how does it change, etc. Okay, so now the balls are getting in motion. Before we talked all about the balls. Now the balls are going to be in motion. Which makes it a little more fun. When we deal with supply and demand, three conditions can exist, okay? Two of which disturb equilibrium, one of which perpetuates equilibrium or has a tendency for equilibrium to adhere, okay? Now, the first situation is that demanders can demand more than suppliers are willing to supply. Okay, if demand is greater than supply, right here, then you have what's called a shortage. Okay, if conversely, the second condition that can exist is that demanders do not demand as much as suppliers are willing to supply. Okay, suppliers want to supply more than demanders are willing to buy. That's a position that we call a surplus. Now, when a surplus takes place, typically inventories develop, okay? Inventories are unsold goods. If they've produced too much, they keep it in inventory. Now, what the invisible hand is, the market mechanism, is that there is a natural tendency for the market on its own, without any intervention, without anybody bothering anything, okay, to clear, okay, which means to restore equilibrium, okay? And so if there is a shortage, such as demand is greater than supply, what's going to happen is demand is going to rise, and or price is going to rise, and as price rises, demand will drop off, supply will increase, and the two will eventually equal each other. The opposite is true of a surplus. If a surplus happens, the price has a tendency to go down, which means suppliers will supply less, demanders will demand more, and the two will meet. Okay, hence a natural tendency for markets to clear. Let's look at that graphically here. Okay, here we have our three conditions. Okay, we talked about the first condition being a shortage, the second condition being a surplus, shortage where demand is greater than supply, surplus where supply is greater than demand. And then the third condition, which I didn't really mention, is where there is no surplus or shortage, where the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. That's our equilibrium point, okay? And what we've been saying is if we have a shortage and we're down here at this price level, okay, you can see because of the low price, suppliers are only willing to supply this much. Demanders want this much because of the low price. Well, for them to meet an equilibrium, the price will naturally rise, demanders will demand less, suppliers will supply more, and equilibrium will be restored. The opposite is true of surplus. If there's a surplus, the price is too high, demanders are only demanding this much, suppliers are supplying this much. So there is a natural tendency for the price to drop, suppliers supply less, demanders demand more, and they meet at this equilibrium point. That's the market mechanism. When it comes to shifting the equilibrium point, now the balls are in motion and we want to pay a little attention to this, okay? We want to pay a lot of attention to this. First, let's deal with a shift in demand. Now remember, we talked about that invisible hand stuff, that market clearing mechanism. That's not about demand shifts, okay? The market clearing mechanism, when we talk, we talk both in supply and demand that movement along the supply line, if there are price changes, it's movement along this line. If there are price changes, there's movement along this line. That's how markets are going to clear. When we talked about the different determinants and the different reasons for the shifting of demand and supply, that's what we're dealing with now, and we want to look at its effect on equilibrium, okay? That's not, shifts in the demand and supply curve is not what we refer to as market failure. Market failure is when there is a surplus or shortage. And market failure, because of the invisible hand, the market mechanism, market failure is a temporary phenomenon. Market failure will eventually correct itself, okay? But for now, we're going to deal with the shifts in the demand curve. And this is from PowerPoint 1.2, where we talked all about the determinants of demand. We talked about conditions that lead to an outward shift in demand, okay, an increase in demand. And you see down here, we had a number of them, and I'll synopsize them at the end of this. Income increases if the number of buyers goes up, if consumer tastes improve, the demand curve will shift upward. Now note the effect that this has on the equilibrium level of price and quantity. We're not moving the supply curve. The supply curve is staying the same. When we shift that demand curve upwards, what happens? The price goes up and the quantity goes up. So price and quantity both go up. Now this is very different, and we want to rest here for a minute and explain this. When we dealt with the law of demand, movement simply along the demand line, what we dealt with was as prices are high, demand is low, and as prices are low, demand is high. Demand, price, and quantity were opposite of one another. They were negatively correlated. Here, when we shift demand, because we're shifting along the supply curve, okay, we're shifting like this, price and quantity will go in the same direction. That's because we're moving along the supply curve. Okay, we're shifting it on the supply curve. Okay, now conversely, when demand drops, this income decrease, consumer tastes tank for a product, they don't like it anymore, etc. Okay, relative goods, whatever. Okay, all those things we talked about in 1.2. Then we see what the result's going to be. When demand drops, we're going to have a drop in price and a drop in quantity. And this will become actually important to us when we get to our macroeconomic discussions, when we deal with aggregate demand and supply and shifts therein. And that's why we want to kind of get this down now. And I mentioned that before. It's always mysterious to me why they put macroeconomics in front of microeconomics. Microeconomics is where you learn the basic principles of economics, including the effect of shifts in supply and demand. With the shifts in supply, okay, we now look at this. And again, we remember that When we change prices, all we're doing is moving along the line. All we're doing is moving along the line. When we change the determinants, any of the factors that condition the amount of supply, then we're going to deal with a shift in the supply curve. Okay, so if we look at this is an inward shift. This is a reduction in supply. You can see that for the same price level now, you're supplying a lot less. Okay, so a drop in supply, and you see down here, decreases in supply, fewer producers, increased operating costs, etc. Okay, all those things we covered in 1.3. That's going to shift the line up, the supply curve up this way. It's going to lead to an increase in price and a reduction in the quantity supplied. Okay, or the quantity at equilibrium. Okay, the equilibrium price and quantity. The equilibrium price will go up, equilibrium quantity will go down. We'll meet right there. Okay. So too, if there's an increase in supply, such as the number of producers increases, costs lower, whatever. Okay. All the stuff we talked about in 1.3, then it'll shift down. You'll have a lower equilibrium price and a higher equilibrium quantity. And again, note that because you're shifting the supply curve, you're leaving the demand curve constant here, and because you're shifting the supply curve, in the law of supply, price and quantity are positively correlated. Okay, and you see that here. Higher prices, higher quantity supplied, lower prices, lower quantity supplied, but that doesn't deal with demand. When you bring demand into the game and you shift the supply curve, you're shifting it on the demand line. And so it's good. They're going to be negatively correlated. Okay, price up, quantity down, price down, quantity up. We'll now move on to shifts in the profit maximizing level of production. And we talked about this a little bit in the discussion of profit maximization, which was, I guess, in 1.3, the second part of it, 1.3b. Okay, now let's look first of all for a marginal cost increase. What kind of things would increase marginal costs? Any factor, anything that increases the cost of a variable resource. You know, from our restaurant example, okay, if the purveyors of our ingredients, okay, increase prices, that's going to shift the marginal cost curve upwards. If we pay our laborers more, that's going to shift the marginal cost curve upward, and you see the effect. If we retain the constant price, whereas here we could produce this much, okay, to maximize profit, because of the increased marginal cost curve, because the cost curve moves up, now we produce this much. It's a reduction in the level of output. Okay, if we were to continue to produce at this level at the new increased marginal cost, you see where we'd be. We'd be at this level right here where we're operating at a loss. You see also that overall the profit area has reduced. All right. And this is why, just kind of as an aside, this is the argument against raising the minimum wage. Okay, if you raise the minimum wage, that raises the wage of workers. Okay, upward shift of marginal cost. The result is that your level of production is going to drop, and because your level of production drops, you don't need as many laborers. And so go ahead and raise the minimum wage, but you're going to have fewer workers. Okay, and we'll see how you're going to correct for that, and it ain't good. You can see, can you? And I'm wondering if you can intuitively see how you would correct for that situation. Okay, an increase in marginal cost that reduces the profit maximizing level of production to here. How do we correct for this? We raise prices. If we raise the price level up to here, okay, then we can retain the same profit max. So if you're going to pay these kids $15 an hour to flip hamburgers at McDonald's, okay, you're going to have to raise the price of hamburgers. All right. Cost decrease, exactly the opposite of what we've just said. What would cause costs to decrease? If our laborers take a cut in pay, Our purveyors decide to charge less for their product if there's a bumper crop of codfish in the Atlantic, and so they can charge less for the codfish that goes into our fish sandwiches. That'll drop marginal cost. And as a result of that, you see our original profit maximizing level of production is right here. When they drop marginal cost, we're able to produce more. This is the basic idea behind supply side economics. If we drop the cost of production, it reduces marginal cost. Because it reduces marginal cost, you're able to produce more. And because you're able to produce more, you're able to hire more people. The basic idea behind it. Now, so too, we often mistakenly think that there is no upside to inflation, to price increases. Well, here's the upside to price increases. Okay, here's our marginal cost. This is our original level of production to maximize profit. If we can charge more for our product, if the price goes up, well, then when the price goes up, it's going to intersect the marginal cost curve here, which will increase production. And anytime you increase production, you can hire more people. And so this means more jobs. And so one of the things that comes out of inflation, we'll look at this in macroeconomics. One of the things that is correlated with inflation is higher levels of employment and lower levels of unemployment. Okay? That's why when we talk about business cycles and we talk about the growth stage of the cycle, okay, in the growth stage of the cycle, demand is up, employment's up, income's up, everything's up, including prices. Okay? The converse of that is, of course, a price decrease. Well, we see what happens if there is a price decrease. And this is something that's not often discussed in economics, is the idea of a price decrease. This is what we call in economics deflation, okay? If there is deflation and prices drop, people often mistakenly think that a reduction in prices is always a good thing. No, it's not always a good thing. Because if you reduce the price, this is our original, at the higher price, that's our profit maximizing level of production. That's how much we'll produce, okay? Well, if we drop the price, our profit maximizing level, first of all, our profit area reduces considerably, and our profit maximizing level of production is now down here. We've had a loss in optimal production level. And when you reduce the level of production, what happens to our laborers? They get fired. And so you have higher unemployment. This is associated with recessionary cycles, which we'll deal with when we get to the business cycle. All right, when we dealt with profit maximization, what we just talked about was the first method of determining where the level of profit maximizing output was, and that was, money out per unit and money in per unit. Well, the money out per unit was the marginal cost curve, which went like this, and the money in per unit was the price of the product, marginal revenue. Well, now we flip that on its side. Gets us to the same point. We flip it on its side, and now what we're dealing with is the marginal revenue produced. That's money in per unit of variable resource, okay, versus money out per unit of a variable resource, which we've simplified to just have labor as our variable resource, okay? And you can see that our original profit maximizing level of output is right here, okay? But if the workers can produce more, okay, and this is going to be the result either of an increase in the marginal quantity per worker or an increase in the price of the product, all right? That's going to shift our profit maximizing level of output out here. Originally, our profit maximizing level of output is here. We capture this much profit. But if the workers improve in their productivity, or if the price of the product goes up, all right, that's going to shift the marginal revenue produced upwards. And now this becomes the profit area, this entire number 2, okay, which includes number 1. And our profit maximizing level of output will be here. Now, why would this happen? Well, price of the product could do it. improvements in the productivity of workers. Okay, why would marginal quantity per worker go up? Why would they become more productive? There are a few different reasons. The two biggest ones are, one is incentive wages. Okay, you pay them more. All right, that gives them an incentive to produce more. It is especially true if you pay them piecemeal. Okay, uh, if you pay them piecemeal per unit that they produce, they'll produce a lot more because they get paid per unit that they produce. All right. What I used to explain to my boss when I was a janitor, when I graduated with my political economy degree, I couldn't find a job, and so I cleaned commercial kitchens. Um, and I used to explain to my boss, I said, you have to understand that minimum wage yields minimum effort. I'm not going to bust a hump for $7 an hour. They pay me $10 an hour, and I'll improve in the quality and quantity of my work. The larger reason has to do with capital equipment, though. Okay, let's say that what I do for my job, I dig foundations for houses. Okay, and I don't have any equipment whatsoever. I have to dig them with my hand. Well, it's going to take me a week to dig a foundation with a house with just my bare hands. So I invest in capital equipment. Okay, I buy a shovel. Now I can dig a foundation in maybe a couple of 3 days. Okay, so I go out and get one of them little bobcats. Now I can dig one in probably less than a day. Okay, I continue to improve my capital equipment. I go out and get a backhoe. Now I can dig at least one a day. All right, that makes me more productive. We'll deal with this when we get to economic growth and the discussions of macroeconomics. When we deal with economic growth in the macroeconomy, the primary reason for it is improvements in the capital to labor ratio, how much capital each laborer has, and we'll deal with that. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Just kind of to introduce it right now. So too, our productivity per worker can drop, and we see what happens if it drops. Our original profit maximizing level of output is right here, okay, capturing this whole area. Well, if our workers produce less, all right, then the profit maximizing level of output drops, and we produce less to maximize profit. And of course, as always, when you drop production, you don't need as many laborers. When you increase production, you can hire more laborers. And we'll look at the implications of that when we get to macroeconomics on employment levels and things like that, and the importance of capital to labor ratio to that and all that good stuff. But for now, suffice to say that if the production per worker goes down, then you're going to have a drop in overall production and a drop in the profit maximizing level of output. Right? Well, so too, and really kind of the interesting thing that I'll note here is note the relationship. This is marginal revenue produced as it has been before. Note that it is exactly inverse of marginal cost. Remember, marginal revenue produced is the amount of money in per unit of a variable resource, the money in per worker. Remember, marginal cost was money out per unit of product. So they're inverses. The marginal cost curve, which looked like a great big smiley face, that was money out per unit. This is money in per unit. The difference is you're dealing with the product as opposed to a variable resource that goes into the production of the product. That's what we're dealing with here. Okay, we start with our original level of production right here. Okay, at this price of labor, we produce this much. There's our profit maximizing level of output. Okay, we capture that whole area right there. But if the price of labor goes up, our profit maximizing level of output is reduced to number 2 here. Our level of production drops, and along with the drop in the level of production, of course, will be a drop in the number of laborers we need. Okay, and so again, I made this comment when we were talking about marginal costs. If we raise minimum wage, if we raise workers' wages, that shifts the price of labor upwards, and you see the result. It means reduced output and higher unemployment, fewer jobs. Okay, the way to correct for that, of course, is inflationary, to increase the price of the product. And just kind of what would happen to this picture, okay, if we were to raise the price of the product? Well, remember what this curve is. This curve is the marginal quantity, the production per worker, multiplied by the price of the product. Okay? Well, so if you raise the price of the product, then this will raise upwards. Okay? And you could potentially have the same level of employment. And so it's inflationary. So, too, if workers take a pay cut, this is our original level of production for profit maximization. We gain this much profit. Workers take a pay cut, all of a sudden, the profit maximizing level shifts out here. We can produce more and therefore hire more workers. This is why one of the first things that happened, United Airlines did this, US Airways does this, did this, everyone does this. When they go into bankruptcy, the reason they go into bankruptcy is because their profit has entirely evaporated. They can no longer meet their financial obligations. One of the first things that happens when they file bankruptcy is they get their laborers to take a pay cut. And people wonder why the laborer would take a pay cut. You take a pay cut because you keep your job. Okay, if you demand this much salary, the price of labor, okay, and the profit has gone down, okay, and this now is the profit level maximizing level, then you lose your. It's better. It's a very simple economic principle. It's better to make something than nothing. Okay, anything is greater than zero. So it makes perfect sense to take that cut in pay if it means keeping your job. Having a job for $7 an hour is better than having a job for $0 an hour. Okay. In the previous two models, and this is just a modification of it, the previous two models, we simplified things. We dealt with the cost being, the only cost being labor. This is if we add other variable resources to that, okay, so that you have the price of marginal variable cost, the price of labor plus other variable costs, the ingredients to our food, okay? And as we said, these are variable resources, variable costs. We didn't really talk about this a lot, but just kind of to throw it in there so that we can cross all the T's and dot all the I's, we throw in variable costs. And you'll note that as production levels go up, variable costs go up. The more you produce, the more ingredients you're going to need in whatever you're producing. And so this is going to bow upwards like that. And so if the price of labor, if the price of ingredients, if the price of any of the inputs goes up, you see what happens to our profit level maximizing level of production. It drops from here down to here. So too, if we drop it, okay, if we can drop variable costs, then we start with this original level of production, and we go up to this level of production, which means we're using more resources, we're hiring more laborers, we're producing more. Okay, and so this just is further amplification of the idea of the constant pressure in economic production to reduce costs of production. Okay, it's why, for example, for the last, it's been about 9 years, maybe 10 now, I don't buy anything on Robert Morris's campus. You know, I used to get myself a sandwich for lunch, something like that. Now I don't buy anything. Why? Because when I go to work, okay, and I provide a service, I bring money in. If I then buy things in support of that service, that increases my cost of production. Okay? That's why when you think about it, teaching online classes is a lower cost of production for me. Why? Because I don't have to drive to school. And therefore I save all the gas cost. Okay. Now, a couple of notes here to conclude on this whole thing. First, we want to deal with firm versus industry profit. Okay. So far, all the shifts in profit equilibrium discussed have been for individual firms. What about the industry in general? okay? When we deal with the individual firms are individual producers of a thing, okay? When you group all of those similar firms together, they become an industry. In markets, okay, in equity markets, we break industries into 11 different categories, okay? Base materials, consumer discretionary, consumer staples, things like that. That's the industry. Individual firms are included in those industries, so whatever they have in common, all right? So when we talk about, for example, something like if we were to discuss the steel industry, every single producer of steel throughout the entire world is an individual firm. But what about the industry in general? In an industry in general, okay, profit does not exist in the long run. All profit evaporates in the short run, okay? The only time you're going to have profit is in the long run, and we've discussed already the difference between those. In the short run, fixed resources are fixed. They cannot be changed. The only thing that can be changed is variable resources. When that's the case, profit is going to be terminal. It will eventually evaporate. The only way to continue it is through investment. Okay, and we talked briefly about the investment decisions. When my average total cost curve reaches its minimum, that's when it's time to expand. Okay, when the average total cost curve rises above the marginal cost curve, then it's time to expand. So for an industry, short-run profit is terminal. Here is why that is the case. All right, now let's go back to our supply shifts. Here is our original point of equilibrium. This is consistent over here with this. So originally, this is the price at equilibrium. This is the production level at equilibrium. This is the price. This is the profit maximizing level of production. You'll see we make this whole area of profit, okay? But profit is the name of the game in economics. That's why anybody does anything, is because they are going to profit from them. This really gets philosophically to the basis of free market economics, okay? People's self-interest drives them. It was one of our assumptions, right? People's self-interest drives them to want to make more profit, okay? Well, when other people see this massive area of profit here, they are going to want a piece of that pie. This is why a lot of us go to college, okay? We discussed this with the discussion of what major we choose. We see that it's a lucrative field. I want to be a lawyer. Lawyer, you make a lot of profit. You make a lot of money. In point of fact, for those of you who are entertaining going into law, most lawyers eke out an existence, either as ambulance chasers or as peeping toms taking, photographs for divorce cases. Okay, most lawyers don't make $250 an hour. All right, just to burst your bubble on that. But we see this massive amount of profit, and so we enter the industry that we see over here. Okay, one of the reasons for a supply shift, for a supply increase, is an increased number of producers. Why is there an increased number of producers? Because they see all this profit and they want some of it, so they enter the industry. That shifts the equilibrium down this way, which reduces the equilibrium price, increases the quantity produced. What does that look like for profit? The price drops, okay? Profit maximizing level of production for each individual firm is less, okay? Profit maximize, the production level for the industry is greater, but for each individual firm, it's less, okay? This is why you want to squash your competitors, because remember, originally, we were getting this whole pie. Somebody has now come in to compete with us, and now we only get this section of the pie. That process is going to continue. As long as this profit exists, other people are going to want a piece of it. And when they want a piece of it, what happens? The supply curve continues to shift outward. The price will continue to drop until you reach this point right here. where marginal revenue is the minimum marginal cost. That is by definition what we refer to as allocative efficiency. That's economic efficiency. People use the term efficient all the time. In economics, we have a very specific technical definition of what is efficiency. And this just summarizes what I've just said. The continued existence of profit will attract additional firms to the industry, which will shift supply further to the right, dropping prices again. This process will continue until all profit evaporates. Now, let's deal with allocative efficiency. What we've just talked about is that process, okay? That process continues until you reach a point where the marginal cost equals the price. More importantly, okay, where the price is the minimum marginal cost. Producers that cannot produce at that low marginal cost will be driven from the industry. This is why efficiency matters. Okay, it forces producers. Competition forces producers to produce for the lowest cost possible. The more producers there are, the more pressure there is. Okay, because all of them want a piece of that profit. Okay, so there's more and more pressure to drop costs. All right. Now, the interpretation of allocative efficiency is that society values, okay, the price they're willing to pay as much as it costs society to produce the thing. That's equilibrium. Okay, that's equilibrium. Marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Price equals quantity. Money in equals money out. Okay, now if the marginal cost is greater than the price, then it is costing society more to produce the thing than they value it. As a result, what the market mechanism is going to do is force a cost to decrease on that. Okay, and producers that can't do that cost decrease will be driven from the industry. Okay, and have to find something else to do. If the marginal cost is less than the price, okay, then society is valuing the product more than it costs the producer to produce, more than it costs society to produce. The product is overvalued, and so the price will drop till it reaches marginal cost. Again, what we've dealt with throughout this presentation is that equilibrium is money in versus money out. Money in, money out. Money out, money in. The system has a natural tendency for those two things to become equal. If they are not equal, they will become equal. If they are equal, that equality will be disturbed and restored. Okay, the system naturally abhors imbalance and will balance itself. The question is, how long does it take for it to balance itself? And what is the effect of the imbalance? Well, now we're more into macroeconomics again, and we'll wait till then to discuss it. Productive efficiency is a little bit different. It's related to allocative efficiency. But in productive efficiency, we're dealing with the average total cost. Average total cost, the value of resources a producer uses to produce a product. Price is the value enjoyed by society of a product. Therefore, if the average total cost is greater than the price, the producer is using more resources than the benefit received from the product. The average total cost is less than the price, then the producer is gaining more benefit than it costs to produce. The system will naturally even that out until the minimum average total cost and the price are the same thing. Now, finally, just a little bit of conclusions, just to synopsize what we've said. First, what we talked about was shifts in supply and demand that cause shifts in market equilibrium. Well, this is just to kind of recollect in your brains what we dealt with in PowerPoint 1.2 and 1.3 with demand shifts. What causes the demand shifts? Income changes, consumer tastes, income up, demand up, consumer tastes, if they improve for the product, demand goes up, price of relative goods, okay, and that that was a little bit more finessed, more nuanced, because if they're substitute products and the price of my substitute goes up, well, demand for the substitute is going to go down, and therefore demand for my good will shift upward. future expectations, all these things from PowerPoint 1.2. I just put them here kind of to synopsize everything. And then the conclusion on profit maximization, which we just finished up. Factors influencing profit maximizing level of production. We had marginal costs, that's money out per unit, versus marginal revenue, money in per unit. Marginal resource product, money in per unit of variable resource, versus marginal variable cost, money out per unit of a variable resource. Money in versus money out. That's all what equilibrium is about, is money in versus money out. Okay? And remember what we said about the market mechanism. Whenever these two things are in imbalance, the market will correct itself. Okay? It is sometimes very painful. You want to know how painful? Just as we're concluding things, I'll tell you how painful. Okay? Equity markets, okay, which is stock markets, things like that, the Dow Jones, the NASDAQ, okay, they rose last year, 2 years, 2017. The S&P rose 27%. 27%. That's outrageous. Okay, so in 2018, you know what happened? Okay, in that case, money in was way more than money out, and the market corrected. Okay, and prices collapsed. The S&P closed on Friday where it was in July of 2017. And your humble narrator here, as a result, lost about 200 grand. So corrections are painful. It all comes back. It all evens out in the end, man, right? It's going to come back. I hope. All right, that concludes PowerPoint Lecture 1.4 on equilibrium, both the profit maximizing level of production equilibrium and market equilibrium. Next, we'll deal with 1.5, which will deal with imperfect markets. Everything we've talked about so far has really dealt with markets where there's perfect competition, and very few markets are like that. So we'll see you again in 1.5.